In this episode, we will explore suffering through logic, philosophy, psychology, and theology, and then turn to a surprising Christian image. Not to explain pain away, but to ask where God might be found when it happens. Before we talk about why pain, why God would allow pain and suffering, let's start somewhere more basic. Pain itself, not as a theory, but as a fact. Loss, grief, injustice, a body that breaks, a world that doesn't explain itself. At some point, explanations stop helping, not because they're wrong, but because they're thin. When someone is suffering, the question usually isn't, what theory explains this? It's, is anyone here with me? That question sits beneath almost every debate about God, not whether a powerful being could exist, but whether such a being would be distant or present, above suffering or inside it. Most discussions focus on power, control, design, authority, but there's another possibility. What if the most important thing about God, if God exists at all, is not power, but willingness to enter our finite world, willingness to enter the conditions of the world rather than override them, to experience consequences rather than merely explaining them, to be marked by the very suffering that raises the question in the first place. Today we'll explore the classic answers to why pain exists, and then return to one unsettling idea that meaning, if it exists at all, may be found not in escaping suffering, but in entering it. One of the most honest questions anyone can ask, believer or not, is this: if there is a God, why would this world look like this? Why pain? Why loss? Why disease? Earthquakes, cruelty, and grief? This question has a name. In philosophy and theology, it's called the problem of theodicy, the attempt to reconcile the idea of an all-powerful, all-loving God with the reality of suffering. And before we go any further, it's worth saying this clearly. There is no single airtight answer. What does exist are several ways thoughtful people across the centuries have tried to approach the question, not to erase suffering, but to understand why a world capable of meaning might also be a world capable of pain. Let's walk through them, not as doctrines to accept, but as lenses to consider. Number one, free will, the cost of meaningful choice. The most common explanation starts with a simple idea. For love, goodness, or moral responsibility to mean anything, they must be freely chosen. If humans were programmed to always do the right thing, we might behave well, but we wouldn't be good in any meaningful sense. We'd be automated. So the argument goes like this: to give people real freedom, the freedom to love, to sacrifice, to create, God would also have to allow the freedom to harm, exploit, or destroy. In this view, much suffering isn't designed, it's permitted, not because pain is good, but because agency is. You may not find this satisfying, and many don't, but it raises an uncomfortable possibility. A world without the risk of evil might also be a world without real moral depth. Number two, soulmaking. Growth requires resistance. Another approach sees life less like a finished product and more like a process. The philosopher John Hick described the world as a vale of soulmaking, not a playground, not a palace, a workshop. The logic is straightforward. You can't develop courage in a world where nothing is dangerous. You can't develop compassion in a world where no one suffers. You can't develop patience in a world where everything is instant. From this angle, pain isn't a punishment, it's friction. And friction is what allows movement, growth, and resilience. Many people, religious or not, recognize this in hindsight. Their hardest seasons often shape them more than their easiest ones. That doesn't make suffering good, but it suggests it may sometimes be productive. Number three, natural law. A stable universe has side effects. Some suffering has nothing to do with human choices, earthquakes, cancer, genetic disorders. So why wouldn't God intervene? One response points to natural laws. For the universe to be intelligible, for cause and effect to exist, it has to behave consistently. Gravity keeps us grounded, and it also causes fatal falls. Plate tectonics makes Earth habitable, and they also cause earthquakes. If those laws were constantly suspended to prevent harm, the world would be unpredictable, incoherent, and impossible to navigate. In other words, a stable universe capable of supporting life may also be a universe where harm is sometimes unavoidable. And number four, distance and ambiguity. Freedom without coercion. There's another less discussed idea. If God exists, perhaps God stays partially hidden on purpose. If a divine presence were undeniable, visible, overwhelming, inescapable, obedience might be inevitable, but choice would not be. Ambiguity creates space, space to seek meaning, space to reject it, space for belief that isn't forced by fear or spectacle. From this view, a world that includes uncertainty, even suffering, allows for genuine response rather than compelled compliance. So, what's the best truth? At some point, theories stop helping, because when someone is grieving, philosophy can sound hollow. So, maybe the question isn't which explanation wins, maybe it's what kind of world would be required for life to be meaningful at all. From biology, we know pain functions as a warning system. Without it, we would die without noticing. From psychology, we know emotional pain signals loss, injustice, and broken connections. Without it, we would lose our humanity. From philosophy, we know freedom requires risk, and growth requires resistance. So the most honest synthesis might be this: if a God exists, then this world appears to be one governed by laws, shaped by development, and entrusted with freedom. Thus, those three things make meaning possible. They also make suffering inevitable. One final thought. There's one more layer to this, one that moves beyond explanation and into meaning. Because many religious traditions don't ultimately answer suffering with arguments. They answer it with an image. In Christianity, that image is not a throne, it's a person. The Shroud of Turin, whether you see it as an authentic burial cloth, a medieval artifact, or simply a powerful symbol, presents a startling idea about God. Not a God untouched by pain, not a God who explains suffering from a safe distance, but a God who is marked by it. The figure on the shroud is not idealized. It's not victorious in any obvious way. It bears wounds consistent with torture, execution, humiliation, and abandonment. And that matters philosophically, even if you remain unconvinced religiously, because this image suggests a radically different answer to the problem of suffering. Here's why pain here's why pain exists. Not here's why pain exists, but here's where God is when it does. If the shroud points to anything, it points to a God who does not exempt himself from the rules of the world he made. A God who doesn't override biology, physics, or violence, but submits to them, which reframes the entire question. If God were merely a cosmic engineer, suffering would be a design flaw. But if God enters the system, accepts its consequences, then suffering becomes the place of encounter rather than abandonment. The God implied by the shroud does not eliminate pain to preserve control. He absorbs it to preserve love. That doesn't solve the problem. It doesn't explain cancer, earthquakes, or broken hearts. But it does answer a different question. Is God indifferent? And the Shroud's answer, symbolic or literal, is no. If there is a God, this vision suggests he is not the kind who watches suffering from above, but the kind who meets it from within. So perhaps the final truth isn't that suffering makes sense. Perhaps it's that meaning survives it. And that question, what kind of God would choose participation over prevention, presence over power, wounds over distance? That question remains open for believers, for atheists, and for anyone still willing to sit with the mystery rather than escape it.